the morning the will was read aloud, Philippa Hargrove stood at the back of the library and listened to her life being unmade. She had worn the dark gray gown because it was the only one that did not require a lady's maid to fasten, and she had fastened it herself at 5 in the morning by the light of a single candle, her fingers stiff with the cold that had crept through the window she could not afford to have sealed. The library at Kedwick Hall was warm by comparison, warmed by a fire someone else had laid in a room that had been her father's, and was no longer anyone's, she knew. Solicitor Renwick sat at the desk with the documents spread before him, and the men who surrounded the desk, her late father's brother, his son, the cousin who had come down from Edinburgh, did not look at her. She was accustomed to that. Her father, the late Earl of Ketwick, had died 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday, quiet as a candle going out. She had been with him at the end. She was the one who had sat through the long nights, who had read to him from the histories he loved, who had kept the household accounts in order when the steward's gout made the stairs impossible. She had done all of this without complaint and without announcement, because that was what she understood a daughter to do. The season had not wanted her, and she had not wanted the season. She had come home from her one ill-fated year in London, with a heart as carefully folded as a letter returned to its envelope, and she had stayed. She had assumed, in the vague way one assumes the sun will rise, that her father had provided for her. Solicitor Renwick's voice was dry and without inflection, and it moved through the clauses of the document like a cart along a familiar road. She heard the words. She heard the bequests to the Edinburgh cousin, a reasonable sum. She heard the charitable gifts to the parish. She heard the disposition of the estate, the title, the entail, all of it, as expected, running along the male line to her uncle, Sir Aldous Hargrove, who stood nearest the fire with his hands folded behind his back, and said nothing. And then Renwick reached the clause regarding the dower provision, and read it aloud, and Philippa understood that her father had left her £300 per year, a life interest in the East Wing, and the guardianship of her situation vested in the event she required a legal advocate in the care of the Earl of Ashmore. There was a pause in the room. She did not know the Earl of Ashmore. She had not been consulted about the guardianship. She was 23 years old, and not a child, and the will had been drawn, Renwick told them calmly, some 8 months prior, before her father's illness had progressed beyond what the physicians could conceal. 8 months. She had still been in the East Wing then, mending the household linen, and writing letters her father could no longer hold a pen to send. Someone had provided for her. The question of whether it would hold was a different matter entirely. Sir Aldous spoke. Then for the first time he said, "Well, 300 a year is adequate for a girl with no expectations." And his voice was smooth and warm, and carried the particular confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment in private. He did not look at Philippa when he said it. He looked at Renwick as though Philippa were a line item in the ledger rather than a woman standing 6 feet away. "A girl with no expectations," Renwick repeated mildly, writing something in the margin of his notes. "Just so," said Sir Aldous. "One hopes she will settle quietly." Philippa said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence in such rooms cost less than speech and lost less ground. She smoothed the front of her gray gown with one gloved hand and looked at the fire. She would meet the Earl of Ashmore, she supposed. She would explain that she did not require a guardian, that her expectations were her own to manage, and that she was grateful for her father's solicitude, but fully capable of directing her own correspondence with a solicitor. She would be polite and direct, and then she would return to the East Wing and begin the work of understanding what £300 per year actually meant. What she did not know, standing at the back of her father's library on that cold January morning, was that the will Renwick had just read aloud was not the will her father had signed. The true will, the one her father had drawn in November, 2 months after the first document, and in full knowledge of how much time he had remaining, sat in the locked inner drawer of a desk in Sir Aldous Hargrove's study, 12 miles away. She did not know that. She could not have known it. But someone else did. The Earl of Ashmore arrived at Kedwick Hall 4 days after the reading of the will, in weather that had turned from cold to brutal. and back to merely gray. Philippa had been informed of his visit by a note delivered that morning, written in a precise hand on plain paper, giving the hour of his arrival and no further comment. She had read it twice and placed it beside her account book, and gone on with what she was doing, which was calculating how far £300 a year would take her if she were careful. She was in the morning room when Fenton, the elderly butler, who had remained in service through some combination of loyalty and inertia, came to tell her that his lordship was in the hall. The Earl of Ashmore was not what she had constructed in her imagination. She had built a solicitor's client, comfortable, incurious, the sort of man who discharged obligations at arm's length and sent his secretary to do the actual work. What came into the morning room was something else. A man of perhaps 34, taller than the doorway, seemed to expect, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to take up no more space than was necessary, in rooms where any motion might be read as aggression. His coat was dark blue, his cravat precisely tied, and his face had the quality of well-maintained stone. Not cold exactly, but not soft. His name, she would learn, was Edmund Vance, and he had been her father's friend in a way she had not been told about, which meant it was either a thing her father had not thought to mention, or a thing he had intended to tell her, and had run out of time to say. He crossed the room and did not offer her a bow that was merely formal. He said, "Miss Hargrove." He said her name as though he had practiced it. "My lord," she said, "I did not expect you so soon. I had reason to come quickly." He looked at her with a kind of attention that was not rude, and was not comfortable. It was the look of a man reading a letter very carefully. "You have had time to examine the terms of your father's bequest? £300 per year and a life interest in the East Wing," she said. "I have examined the terms. And do they satisfy you?" She considered the question seriously, because it seemed to deserve seriousness. "They are less than I expected," she said. "My father was a careful man. £300 is not what I would have anticipated as the whole of his provision." The Earl of Ashmore looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face and was controlled before she could name it. "No," he said, his voice level. "It is not." She would think about those 3 words for a long time afterward. If you have spent any time in a house in mourning, you will know how the runes change. Leave a comment below if this story is already pulling at you. Sir Aldous Hargrove came to Kedwick Hall the following week, which was his right, as the new Earl and the legal occupant of the principal rooms. He came with his wife, a narrow woman named Beatrice, and with his son, Gervase, who was 20, and had the bland confidence of a young man who has never been told he is wrong about anything. They took the large drawing room. They took the dining room. They took the stables. They did not take the East Wing because the will was explicit on that point. But Beatrice Hargrove made clear through the precise management of her silences that the East Wing was a temporary arrangement that would benefit everyone to reconsider. Philippa receded into her rooms and her accounts and the small domestic circuit of her days. She had the companionship of Mrs. Seja, Penny, the housekeeper who had been at Ketwick Hall since before Philippa was born, a stout woman with gray hair and a face like a comfortable chair, who brought her tea in the morning and information in the afternoon. Through Mrs. Penny, she learned that Gervase Hargrove had taken her father's study for his own use, that he had removed the books to the corridor, that he had gone through the desk drawers. She did not know what he had been looking for. She would learn eventually. The Earl of Ashmore came again 2 weeks after his first visit, and this time he came without announcing himself, which was irregular. Fenton let him in out of some combination of habit and the authority that seemed to belong to the man, regardless of whose house he was standing in, and Philippa met him in the corridor with her household accounts under her arm and ink still on her left forefinger. "You have been to see Renwick," she said, because she could see it in the set of his jaw and the direction of his gaze, which was not at her, but at something just past her. "I have," he said, and he looked at her then. "Walk with me." It was not a question. She had already observed that his instructions had the form of commands and the function of something else, and she had already observed that the something else was not unkindness. She fell into step beside him, and they went down the corridor toward the east wing, away from the sound of Beatrice Hargrove directing a footman in the entrance hall. "Your father came to see me in October," he said, when they were out of earshot. "He was not well. He came because he wished to revise his will, and he wished to do so through channels that did not involve his brother." Philippa stopped walking. "He showed me the revised document," the Earl said. "He read it to me. The estate, in the absence of a male heir, was to pass to a trust, administered in your name, with provisions for you to manage the property until such time as you married or chose to sell. The 300 a year was supplemental, not the whole. The East Wing provision was a temporary arrangement, not a permanent one," she said after a moment. "That is not what Renwick read aloud." "No." Then someone replaced the document. "Yes." She stood in the corridor of the house her father had built from a near ruin and looked at the floor and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Gervais has been through the study. I know. They will say the revised will does not exist. They already have," the Earl said. "Wah!" "When I raised the question with Renwick this morning, he told me he had drawn only one document, and had seen only one document, and had no record of any revision. He was either lying, or he had been given a document that appeared to be the original." He paused. "There is a second copy." She looked at him. "Your father was careful," he said, "more careful than they anticipated. He sent a copy to his sister in Bath, which she has held unopened, as he instructed, waiting for word from me." The corridor was cold. She was aware of exactly how cold it was in a way that had not registered a moment before, the draft from the east window moving across the back of her neck. "He trusted you," she said. "He was my friend for 20 years, the Earl said. "He trusted me with the things he most needed preserved," she said. "Then you knew this would happen." He said, "I suspected it was possible. I hoped I was wrong." She was 34 years old now, in her understanding of her own life, not 23, because grief compresses time in one direction and stretches it in another, and the past 6 weeks had added 10 years to her comprehension of how the world worked. She thought of her father sitting in that study in October, ill and careful, writing a letter to his sister in Bath, and enclosing a document he did not want his brother to find. She thought of what it had cost him to do that quietly. To trust a friend with the knowledge rather than a legal office. To hope that the machinery he had set in motion would hold after he was gone. It had cost him everything, and it had perhaps saved her everything. And she would not cry about it here in the corridor with this man watching her, because there was work to be done, and crying was for afterwards. "What do we do?" she said. He did not say "we" back to her. He said, "I write to your aunt. You say nothing to Sir Aldous or his family. We proceed as though the situation is as they believe it to be. For how long?" "Long enough." She wanted to ask him what long enough meant, and she wanted to ask him how well he had known her father, and she wanted to ask him a dozen other things that the corridor and the cold and the careful distance between them did not permit. Instead, she looked at the ink on her left forefinger and said, "Thank you, my lord," he said almost to himself. James would have hated this. She understood then that her father's name had been James, that the Earl had called him James, and that there was a grief here that was not only hers. The Earl had been 42 years old when the thing that broke him had happened, which was to say, he had been a man who had survived 39 years without being broken and had perhaps grown careless in his confidence. His wife Eleanor had died of a fever in the 3rd year of their marriage, and he had been present, and he had sent for 3 physicians, and the 3rd physician had come too late, and he had sat with her while she left, and had understood afterward that no amount of rank or intention could hold a thing that was going anyway. He had learned something from that, a specific lesson that had taken the form of restraint. He did not reach for what he was not certain he could hold. He had kept his house in order, and his obligations met, and his feelings, in the locked interior room of his chest, where they did not risk anything they could not afford to lose. He had not expected James Hargrove's daughter. He had seen her once before, briefly, years ago, at a dinner at Ketwick Hall when she had been perhaps 17 and had sat at the table's edge and said almost nothing, and afterward corrected a factual error in something the Edinburgh cousin had said with a single quiet sentence, and then looked back at her plate. He had not thought of it again until now. Now he thought of it often. He was aware of the precise distance between them in every room they occupied together. He was aware of the sound of her moving in the corridor, outside his visits. He was aware, in a way he found inconvenient, that she had not cried once in his presence. Not at the will reading, not in the corridor, not when she had understood the full shape of what had been done to her, and that the not crying cost her something real, something she paid in the set of her shoulders and the careful economy of her movements. He had told himself he was discharging an obligation to a dead friend. He was aware that this was not the whole truth. The third time Beatrice Hargrove referred to Philippa as the poor girl with her small income was at a dinner in early February, and she said it to the wife of the local magistrate, Mrs. Carradine, with the particular warmth of a woman distributing charitable feeling, and she said it in a voice just loud enough that Philippa, seated 4 places away, could not have failed to hear it. Mrs. Cree, Archie. Carradine, who was a sensible woman and had known the Hargrove family for decades, made a small sound that was not agreement, and looked briefly in Philippa's direction. Philippa ate her soup. The Earl, seated across the table in 2 places to the left, said nothing. She saw his hand still briefly against the stem of his wineglass, and she saw the careful neutrality of his face, and she understood that he had heard it too, and had made a decision about the hearing of it that was not the same decision she had made. He had begun visiting weekly, by this point. He had taken to arriving at an hour that coincided with Sir Aldous' habitual visit to the home farm, which meant that he and Philippa had the morning room to themselves for an hour or 90 minutes before the rest of the house reasserted its claim on the day. They talked about the correspondence with her aunt in Bath, which was proceeding carefully. They talked about Renwick, whom the Earl had been quietly investigating through a colleague in London. They talked about the legal strategy, which required patience the Earl seemed to have in abundance, and which Philippa was developing through discipline, if not inclination. On one of these mornings she had been mending a frayed cuff when he arrived, which she had put away quickly but not quickly enough, and he had looked at the needle and thread still on the table beside her, and said, "You do not have a lady's maid." "I have not required one," she said, which was not quite the same thing. He had said nothing further, but the following week he had arranged, through some mechanism she never entirely traced, for Mrs. Penny to have an assistant in the East Wing which was more practically useful than a lady's maid, and which Philippa had accepted without comment, because accepting it gracefully seemed the only option that did not require her to perform a resentment she did not feel. The correspondence with her aunt in Bath arrived in the 3rd week of February. Her aunt, a widow named Margaret Thorne, who had never forgiven her brother Aldous for something that had happened 30 years ago, and whose memory for grievances was apparently excellent, had held the document as instructed and was prepared to produce it. She had written to confirm this in a letter that was brief and precise, and ended with these words: "Your father was not a careless man, and I have not been a careless sister. Come when you are ready." She was not able to go to Bath herself. The terms of the East Wing arrangement made any extended absence complicated, and she was not entirely certain that Sir Aldous would not find a way to consolidate something in her absence. She told the Earl this, and he had looked at her for a moment and said, "I will go." "You cannot simply take possession of a legal document on my behalf," she said. "I am your father's appointed guardian," he said. "I can represent your interests in this matter." "That is precisely what a guardian is for," she said. "I do not need a guardian." "No," he said. "You do not." He looked at her directly, which he was careful not to do too often, and she felt the weight of the look in the way one feels warmth from a fire at a careful distance. But the law disagrees, and the law is what we are working with. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Go then," she said. "Please." He went to Bath. He returned 4 days later with a sealed document, and the news that Margaret Thorne had also recalled the existence of a letter her brother James had sent with the document. a letter in his own hand explaining his intentions for the estate and naming the date of the revision and the reason for the secrecy. The letter named Sir Aldous by name. It named Gervais. It was not the kind of letter a man wrote without knowing he was writing for posterity. She read the letter the evening the Earl returned, standing in the morning room, while he stood by the window and looked out at the darkened garden. She read it slowly, which was not her usual way with correspondence, because it was her father's handwriting, and she had not seen her father's handwriting in 6 weeks, and the shape of the letters hit her somewhere between the throat and the chest, and stayed there. When she finished, she folded the letter and held it, and did not look at the Earl. He was not surprised, she said. He knew what Aldous would do. He suspected it. He wrote this, knowing he would not be here to stop it. Yes. She stood with the letter in her hands and the fire at her back, and tried to account for what she was feeling, which was a specific variety of grief that had no clean name. The grief, not of losing a father, but of discovering the full dimension of a father, of finding him larger and more deliberate in his love than she had known to look for. "He trusted you?" she said again. He said, his voice quiet in the firelit room. "He trusted that I would not leave you undefended." She looked at him then. He was still looking at the dark window, his profile to her, and there was something in his face she could not read at this distance, some careful management of expression that told her he was working very hard at stillness. Her heart did something inconvenient. If you have ever discovered that someone loved you more carefully than they could say while they were living, you understand precisely what Philippa felt standing in that room. Those of you who have been here from the beginning, you already know this. Story is not over. The legal challenge to the will was filed in March, when the weather softened enough to make travel to London possible, and Renwick could no longer pretend that the matter was uncomplicated. The Earl brought the document and the letter together, presented them to a senior colleague in Lincoln's Inn, who specialized in contested testamentary matters, and returned with the news that the case was strong, and the case was also going to take time. Time was the difficulty. Time was what Sir Aldous understood and had prepared for. He had done the calculation correctly. The longer the estate remained in his name, the more difficult the reversal would become, not legally but practically, because a man in possession of an estate is always easier to defend than a woman attempting to reclaim one. Gervais Hargrove began to make himself pleasant to Philippa in mid-March, which she recognized immediately as a strategy, and which she managed by being consistently polite and consistently busy. He was not unpleasant in himself. He was merely convenient, and she was a solution to a problem. He had not anticipated if she married Gervais. The question of the estate became moot, her claim dissolved. The legal challenge became an embarrassment to her own household. His mother, Beatrice, had evidently explained this arithmetic to him, because the pleasantness had a quality of rehearsal. She told the Earl about it at their next morning meeting, during which he stood at the window with a stillness that had gone slightly rigid. "He said he admired your composure," the Earl said. "He did, and that you were precisely the sort of woman the estate needed." He paused. "His words? More or less." She looked at her hands. "His mother's words, I think, somewhat rearranged." He said nothing for a moment. She watched his jaw and the controlled muscles there. "You are not considering it," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I am not considering it." He turned from the window then, which he almost never did directly. He looked at her with the full weight of whatever he was carrying behind his face, and she felt it the way she had felt the letter in the chest, between the throat and the sternum, that specific location where important things seem to land when they cannot be managed anywhere else. "Good," he said. And then he said nothing further, and they moved on to a discussion of the legal timeline, and she spent the rest of that morning being very careful about where she let her attention rest. The spring assembly at Ashford was held in the second week of April, and Beatrice Hargrove made clear that Philippa was expected to attend. It was an expectation framed as a courtesy, which was how Beatrice framed most of the things she expected, of warm tone and a specific assumption beneath it that resistance would be noted and recorded. Philippa attended because she had attended the spring assembly every year of her life, and because not attending would give Beatrice a kind of quiet victory she was disinclined to provide. The assembly rooms in Ashford were a modest but handsome set of chambers above the coaching inn, hung with candles and filled with the expected county crowd. The Carradines, the Morley family from the next valley, two families recently arrived in the neighborhood, whose names Philippa was still learning. She wore the cream gown she had remade twice in 3 years, which was not shabby, but which required careful management. And she went in on Mrs. Penny's arm, which was not the arm one preferred at an assembly, but which was the arm available. She was standing with a cup of tea. She was not drinking when she saw the Earl arrive. He had not mentioned attending. She had not expected him. He came in with 2 men. She did not know. Was greeted by the Morley family with the particular warmth reserved for a man of rank in a room that contained one, and moved through the early business of the evening with the same careful economy of motion she had come to recognize as his natural register. He did not look for her immediately. She noticed when he found her. He came to stand beside her some 20 minutes into the evening, and said nothing for a moment, which was characteristic of him. She said, "I did not know you would be here. Carradine invited me last week," he said. "I thought it prudent to come." She looked at him. "Prudent? Sir Aldous is here," he said quietly. "Gervais as well. And there's solicitor whom I noticed in the corner near the punch bowl. That particular combination at a public assembly suggests they intend to do something this evening." She felt the familiar tightening of dread just below her ribs. What sort of something? "I am not certain. I did not want you to be here alone when they did it." She looked across the room to where Beatrice Hargrove stood, with 2 women from the Morley connection, smiling and bright-eyed, holding a fan at precisely the right angle. "Gervais asked me to dance with him earlier," she said. "And I said I was not dancing this evening. He said, 'That may not have been enough.' It was not enough." The something that Sir Aldous had planned became apparent within the hour, when he stood up in a moment between the second and third dances and, in the particular way of a man who has prepared remarks, announced to the general company that his niece had done him the honor of agreeing to consider a formal understanding with his son, that the 2 young people had found a great deal in common in recent weeks, and that he expected to have a happy announcement to make before the summer. Philippa stood very still. She heard it the way one hears a sound in a dream, not quite real and then completely real, and then she felt the room's attention shift toward her like a tide. And she was in the center of it with the cream gown, and the tea she was not drinking and no arm to take. But Mrs. Spar, Penny's, who had gone rigid beside her. She heard a woman near the window say in a carrying murmur, "Well, the poor relation settles after all." She recognized Beatrice's voice behind her, warm and carrying. "The girl with no prospects finds her footing. One is glad for her." 2 voicings. Now. The third had been in January, at Kedwick Hall, in the library, the morning after the will was read, when Sir Aldous himself had said it. A girl with no expectations. 3 voicings. And here, now, the full weight of them fell on her at once. In the assembly room, in the cream gown, in front of everyone she knew. She put the cup of tea down on the nearest surface, and stood up straight, which she could do, because 23 years of managing her own posture in difficult rooms had made it automatic. And then the crowd shifted. It shifted because the Earl of Ashmore had crossed the room. She saw him before she felt him, which was the order in which things happened to her. She saw his dark coat moving at the edge of the crowd, the deliberate 3 strides that brought him from the far corner to the place where she was standing. And she watched the room see him coming. The small recalibrations of posture, the attention that a man of his rank commanded simply by being in motion towards something.
He stopped beside her.
He did not look at Sir Aldous. He looked at her and he said her name, her given name, in a voice that was not loud, and did not need to be. "Philippa." The room was very quiet. He said, "I will not permit a misrepresentation to stand uncorrected in this company." He turned then, and the turning was the slowest and most deliberate thing she had ever watched him do, and the room held its breath with her. He said, to the assembled company and to Sir Aldous in particular, whose face had gone a color between brick and white, "Miss Hargrove has agreed to no such understanding. She is in fact engaged to me." Silence. The particular silence of a room that has just had to entirely rearrange its understanding of an evening. Sir Aldous said, "My lord, I do not." "She is engaged to me," he said again. And his voice was level and final, and it was 12 words or fewer, and it was the most irrevocable thing she had heard said in a room since Renwick had read aloud the false will on the January morning that had changed her life. "And the matter of the Ketwick estate will be settled through the courts with evidence that will not favor your claim." The solicitor near the punch bowl had stopped moving. Beatrice Hargrove's fan stilled at an angle it had never been still at before. Mrs. Carradine, who was a sensible woman and had known the family for decades, made a sound that was not ambiguous. Several people near her made similar sounds. The Morley family murmured together, and the murmur had the quality of general recognition. Philippa stood beside the Earl of Ashmore, and did not faint, and did not cry, and did not smile, because none of those things were available to her in that moment. She was inside something that was happening faster than she could manage. She was aware of his arm at the edge of her sleeve, not quite touching, and of the particular quality of stillness he had returned to after the declaration, the stillness of a man who has said the necessary thing and intends to stand beside it. She looked at Sir Aldous. Sir Aldous looked at the Earl, and then at the solicitor, and then at his wife, and his wife looked at her fan. Gervase Hargrove, 20 years old and confident by habit, said nothing at all. After a moment he said quietly, for her alone, "Forgive me. I should have asked you first," she said without looking at him. "Yes," he said. "I will ask you now, if you prefer," she said, still without looking at him. "Not in this room." "No," he agreed. "Not in this room." They left the assembly together, which was irregular, and no one attempted to prevent them. The garden behind the coaching inn was dark and smelled of early spring, the ground still soft from the recent rains, and they walked to the end of the path that faced the open field, and stood there without speaking for a long moment. He said, "I owe you an apology." "You do," she said. "I made a decision on your behalf without consulting you." He paused. "I made it because I could not stand there and allow the misrepresentation to continue, and because I could not allow you to walk out of that room carrying something I had the means to remove." She thought about this carefully. She thought about her father in October writing a letter to his sister in Bath, trusting a friend with the full weight of what needed to be preserved. She thought about the kind of love that expresses itself not in declaration but in action, in the careful maintenance of things that might otherwise be lost. She said, "Were you in earnest about the engagement?" He was quiet for a long time. The field in front of them was dark and still, and somewhere in the distance a carriage was moving along the road, its lantern visible through the trees. He said, "Philippa." He said it the way he had said it in the room, quietly, and with a weight that was not performing anything. "I have been conducting myself for the past 3 months in a manner that a man only conducts himself when he is very much in earnest and very much afraid of presuming," she said. "You have been afraid of presuming?" "You were in your father's house," he said, "in a situation not of your choosing, with a legal entanglement that made any expression of my own particular interest a potential exploitation of your circumstances." "And now?" she said. "Now," he said, "I have apparently announced it to 40 people and a solicitor, which removes some of the question of discretion." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the field, his profile to her, and she could see the deliberate management of stillness that she had learned to read as the visible surface of something else entirely. She said, "Ask me then." He looked at her. He had the eyes. She had thought this before, of a man who had learned to want things very carefully. He said, "Will you marry me? Not for the estate, not for the legal complications, not because I announced it in a room and painted you into a corner. Because I would like, very much, to have the right to stand beside you." She said, "Yes." He said, "You are certain?" She said, "I have been managing my certainty since approximately the morning you stood in the corridor and told me my father had known what Aldous would do. And I looked at your face and understood that you had been carrying that knowledge alone for months, because he asked you to." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was very nearly almost a kind of smile. She looked at the smile, which was a significant event, and felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the season. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked back along the dark garden path toward the light. The legal matter resolved itself over the following 3 months in the procedurally efficient and emotionally exhausting way that legal matters do. Renwick, when confronted with the copy of the revised will and the letter in James Hargrove's own hand, produced a story about a substitution that had occurred in his office without his knowledge, which was technically possible and which no one entirely believed, and which served the function of allowing him to cooperate without entirely condemning himself. The senior colleague in Lincoln's Inn found this satisfactory. The courts found it adequate. Sir Aldous Hargrove, faced with the evidence and with the reality of the Earl of Ashmore as an adversary on the other side of the case, withdrew his claim in May. He did not apologize. He went back to his house in Edinburgh, and his wife went with him, and Gervase was sent abroad, which was the solution that families in difficult situations often found for young men who had gone along with things they should not have. It was not punishment, it was displacement, and it was adequate. Renwick retired. The estate returned to Philippa Hargrove, as her father had intended. She was married in June, in the small church at the edge of the Ketwick village, where she had been baptized, with Margaret Thorne come up from Bath and seated in the front pew, with the expression of a woman whose long patience had been justified. Mrs. Penny cried, which was unexpected and entirely welcome. The Carradines came, and the Morley family, and half the neighborhood, because the neighborhood had had time to arrive at its own verdict, and the verdict was sound. The Ketwick estate in summer was a different kind of place than the Ketwick estate in January. The east wing caught the afternoon light. The kitchen garden that she had kept running through the winter was green and producing. The desk in the study had been moved back from the corridor and the books reshelved, and on the mantelpiece above the study fire, she had placed the framed miniature of her father that had always stood in his bedroom. A small portrait on ivory that she had moved herself on the morning she reclaimed the room. He found her there on the first evening of their marriage, standing in the study doorway looking at the miniature. He came and stood beside her. She said, "He would have liked you." "He did like me," Edmund said. "For 20 years. I mean as this," she said, "as the man standing here now." He looked at the miniature for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said, without any of the usual management, "I think he planned it." She had thought the same thing in the 4 months between January and June, and had decided it was either true or it was the kind of comfort one constructs from the available evidence, and that either way it held. She reached up and touched the edge of the miniature's frame, adjusting it the single degree it needed. He put his hand over hers, on the frame, his warm palm over her fingers. She left her hand where it was. Outside, the summer evening was settling into dark, the long kind of Ketwick dark that came slowly and smelled of the kitchen garden, and the turned earth and the distant fields going still. The candles in the study had been lit by someone, Fenton perhaps, who had been lighting candles in this room since before she was born, and who would continue to light them in his own good time, regardless of what dynasties came and went around him. The study was warm. The miniature was straight. Her husband's hand was over hers, and she could feel the specific weight of it, the warmth, and the steadiness, and she thought of her father writing his careful letter in October, trusting that the machinery he set in motion would hold, trusting that the right people would do the right things, in the right order. It had held. She turned her hand over, palm up, and took his hand properly, and he let her, and the candles burned on in the quiet study of the house that was hers, and the evening came in gentle and dark from the garden, and the portrait of her father watched from the mantelpiece with the same calm expression he had always worn. For those of you who have stayed all the way to the end of Philippa's story, thank you. If this moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest.